Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to this series on Yiddish in transit. Today we're going to explore a fascinating chapter in American Jewish history and in modern Yiddish culture, the emergence of the Yiddish press in the United States. This lecture is titled The Paper Bridge because that's exactly what the Yiddish newspaper represented for millions of Jewish immigrants. It was a source of news and information, but also a lifeline connecting Yiddish immigrants to each other, to the old country, and to a new vision of what they would become or could become in America. We'll trace the journey from humble basement operations run by family households to powerful media empires that shaped American Jewish identity. Before we dive into the American story, let's establish the global context. This map shows the distribution of more than 10 million Yiddish speakers before World War II. Let me emphasize a few key points. First, the largest concentration, 7 million speakers in Eastern and Central Europe. You can see the yellow circle. And then 3 million speakers in North America. You can see it on the red circle. We can also see less significant presence in Palestine, South America, South Africa, Australia, and Asia. I'll just mention briefly that during World War II, there were also Yiddish-speaking refugees and Yiddish culture in North Africa, mainly in Morocco, as well as in Iran. Today, we'll focus on the red circle, Yiddish speakers and the Yiddish press in the United States. This demographic reality is crucial for understanding our story. Yiddish was spoken by millions across the globe. The American Yiddish press emerged as part of this broader Yiddish-speaking world, but it would develop its own unique character. There is also the immigrant context. Yiddish in America was fundamentally a phenomenon of immigrants from Eastern Europe. In its emergence in the 1870s, the main figures were immigrants from the Suwałki region in northern eastern Poland and surrounding areas. Later, and especially from the turn of the century onwards, the waves were broader and included various areas in the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Romania, and more. Unlike in Europe, where Yiddish print culture, though not necessarily Yiddish press, had centuries-old roots, in America it was being created anew, a culture of and for immigrants. To understand the Yiddish press in America, we need to look at what came before it in Europe, on that side of the paper bridge. The Hebrew press had a strong, relatively continuous presence in 19th century Europe. This was the model that early Yiddish and Hebrew journalists knew and drew upon. Let's see some key examples. This is Hamelitz, the advocate or the translator, founded in Odessa in 1860 and from 1871 published in St. Petersburg. First it was a weekly, and from 1886 it was a daily until 1904. What we see here is a volume from 1879. From 1862, Hamelitz had a Yiddish supplement titled Kol Mevasser, which introduced the Yiddish works of Mendele Moicher Sforim, Shalom Yankev Avramovich, to the Yiddish readers. This is considered to be the beginning of modern Yiddish literature. The next example is Hatzfira, literally the dawn, founded in Warsaw in 1862. This too was a weekly. It ceased after 6 months and resumed in Berlin in 1874 and then moved back to Warsaw. From 1886, Hatzfira also was a daily. And you can see in the subtitle that it is not only a newspaper for recent news, but also a cultural adventure and an educational tool. And this is the Hebrew weekly Hamagid, the Declarer, founded in Lich in East Prussia in 1865, moved to Berlin in 1890, and then to Krakow in 1892, published until 1903. Why are these publications relevant to our story? These Hebrew newspapers provided a template for Jewish journalism. The format, the structure, the combination between science, literature, and politics were models for the pioneers of Hebrew and Yiddish press in America. But there was a crucial difference. Hebrew press existed and even flourished in Europe, while the Yiddish press was almost non-existent there, suppressed by various factors: censorship from governments, social stigma. Yiddish was considered undignified by many educated Jews, and the dominance of Hebrew among the Maskilim, enlighteners. As we'll soon see, the linguistic, political, and cultural situation in America was quite the opposite. This slide shows the painting La Ligne de Feu, The Line of Fire, from 1886 by Pierre-Georges Janiot, depicting the Battle of Mars-la-Tour. Why am I showing you a European battlefield painting? Because this war, the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, was one of the catalysts for the founding of the first Yiddish newspapers in America. Jewish immigrants in America were eager for news from Europe, from home, from the Alter Heim. The war created a demand for information. This wasn't unique to Jews. It was part of a broader phenomenon of immigrant press in America serving as a bridge to the homeland. It also occurred again in the late 1890s, when Jewish readers in America were interested in the Dreyfus Affair in France, and their demand for news in Yiddish hyped the popularity and distribution of the Yiddish press almost overnight. (1871) marks a watershed year. The first Hebrew letter newspapers appeared in America, in Hebrew and in Yiddish. 2 newspapers, 2 languages. This one in Hebrew, הצופה בארץ החדשה, The Observer in the New Land. And a second publication in Yiddish, The Post, of which we have no documentation. Before 1871, there were already Jewish newspapers in America, but they were published in English or in German by German Jewish immigrants from the mid-19th century or established American Jews. Later, from 1910, there would also emerge Ladino newspapers. But from the 70s until the turn of the century, it was Hebrew and Yiddish in Hebrew letters. The key figure for both pioneering publications was Tzvi Hirsch Bernstein, born in 1846 and died in 1907. Bernstein, an immigrant from the Suwałki region, as I mentioned, founded the Hebrew and Yiddish press in the United States. He even wrote for Hamagid back in Europe, maintaining that transnational connection. These first Hebrew and Yiddish publications struggled with professional and technical challenges. For example, establishing editorial standards, determining orthography, choosing typefaces, obtaining Hebrew type, the actual Aleph Bet letters, setting right-to-left text, training typesetters, and so on. Before sustainable newspaper emerged, there were interesting attempts. The Hebrew Noyes, the Hebrew News, a multilingual publication by Jacob Kahn from the early 1870s, which was essentially a campaign sheet in 4 languages, Hebrew, German, English, and Yiddish. And also the Yiddische Zeitung, the Jewish newspaper or the Yiddish newspaper, published by Y.K. Buchner, produced through lithography before the use of letterpress. This was also in the early 1870s. Bernstein faced several challenges that would teach the next generation valuable lessons. First, the limited readership. There simply weren't enough Yiddish and Hebrew readers in America in the early 1870s to sustain a newspaper. The immigrant community was still quite small, and many who could read preferred German or English. Yiddish readers were not used to reading a daily paper or any paper. Second, financial difficulties. Bernstein lacked the capital to keep the operation running profitably. He was primarily a writer and an intellectual, even a typesetter, but he wasn't an entrepreneur. Third, technical problems, like the challenges of Hebrew typography and right-to-left typesetting, proved more difficult and expensive than expected. Finding skilled typesetters who could work with Hebrew letters was nearly impossible. However, Bernstein's contribution was crucial. He proved that Hebrew letter newspapers were possible in America, establishing that there was at least some demand. He established connections between American and European Jewish journalism, bringing knowledge of European newspaper formats and practices, and he paved the way for more successful ventures. Let's ground ourselves geographically. This is New York City in 1910. By this time, the Yiddish press was already a major institution. By the early 20th century, there were about 1 million Yiddish speakers in New York City out of its 1.5 million Jews, with 5 million residents in the city total. This made New York the central city for Yiddish cultural production and consumption worldwide. Until the late 19th century, the major Jewish centers were in Eastern Europe, Warsaw, Vilna, and to some degree Odessa and later Moscow. But Jewish mass migration created a new center, New York City, and with it, a new reality. Yiddish culture as immigrant culture, created within and in dialogue with the larger American consumer culture, capitalism, and freedom from censorship. Other American cities also had significant Yiddish newspapers, though none reached New York's scale of influence. In Chicago, Yiddish newspapers served the Midwest's growing Jewish population. Philadelphia had several Yiddish publications as well. Boston served New England's Jewish communities, and even smaller cities like Cleveland, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh had their own Yiddish newspapers. These regional papers often had distinct characters reflecting their local communities. They covered local labor disputes specific to their cities' industries and reported on regional Jewish community affairs and organizations. Yet New York's dominance was undeniable. Its newspapers had the largest circulations, reaching hundreds of thousands of readers. It employed the best-known writers and exercised the most influence on American Jewish public opinion. Many regional papers even reprinted content from New York Yiddish publications to fill their pages. This centralization reflected broader patterns of Jewish settlement and urban concentration in America. And now we come to the most important figure in the growth of both Yiddish and Hebrew press in America until the late 1890s, Kasriel Sarasohn. Like Bernstein, Sarasohn was an immigrant from the Suwalki region. He arrived in the United States with some family members in the late 1860s, settled in New York in the early 70s, and began his Yiddish press enterprise. What made Sarasohn unique? First, he was an entrepreneur. He understood the Yiddish press had to be commercially viable. Second, his business approach. Sarasohn counted on family resources. His whole family worked together. Third, he had an all-encompassing approach. His newspapers were designed to be, quote, an organ for all Israel, in Yiddish, Klal Yisrael, not just for intellectuals or maskilim. Unlike Bernstein, who was primarily a writer, Sarasohn understood business from the ground up. When he arrived in America, he initially tried various occupations to support his family. Like many immigrants, he struggled to find his footing in the New World. But he recognized an opportunity that others had missed. The growing Jewish immigrant community needed information, needed connection, needed something to read in a language they understood, and they needed it at a price they could afford. Sarasohn saw the newspaper not just as a cultural project or an educational mission, but as a viable business that could sustain itself and even grow. He understood that to succeed, he needed to appeal to a broader readership, not just the educated elite. He also understood the critical importance of advertising. His newspapers carried ads for everything from steamship tickets back to Europe to matchmaking services to kosher butchers and boarding houses in Lower Manhattan and more. These ads were crucial. They provided essential revenue that subscription fees alone could never cover, but they also made the newspaper indispensable to both business and readers. Businesses needed to reach the immigrant market, and readers needed to know where to find services. Sarasohn cultivated careful relationships with advertisers, offering competitive rates and guaranteeing prominent placement. He understood that the newspaper had to serve the entire immigrant society and the entire immigrant economy to be truly successful. In 1874, Sarasohn founded the weekly Yiddish Gazetten, the Jewish Gazette. In 1885, he founded Yiddish's Tageblatt, the Jewish daily news. This was the first Yiddish daily in the United States. In fact, it was the first Yiddish daily in the world. America preceded Europe in daily Yiddish journalism by several decades. The first Yiddish daily was published in Europe only in 1903. Let's hear Sarasohn's memories from these early days. My family was quite small, me, my wife, and my 3 children. Yechezkel, the eldest, was the manager and accountant. My daughter, 13, and my youngest son, Avram Chaim, only 10, the last 2 were the typesetters. However, despite their young age, they were focused on one single thought, sacrificing all their strength for the existence of the Gazetten. As you can see, he doesn't mention his daughter's name. Her name was Rivka. This quote gives us an insight into the reality of immigrant life and newspaper production, the material and economic struggles, the family-based small-scale nature of the enterprise, working for modest profit, not wealth. Just like a sweatshop, the newspaper was run from home. Sarasohn described the living condition, which gives us an opportunity to discuss immigrant life in general in late 19th century New York. Families lived in crowded tenements, small apartments that also served as workplaces, especially for textile work. Sarasohn's newspaper operation literally functioned from their home, much like a sweatshop. This was his modest beginning. And here is an issue of Sarasohn's Yiddish Gazetten, the Jewish Gazette. We can see how the format was influenced by the European Hebrew press, but gradually adopted American newspaper models, like its contemporary New York Tribune, with multiple columns of texts, ads, and images later on. Here we can see 3 columns instead of 2 in the Hebrew press. American newspapers had sometimes 5 or 6 text columns. If we look closely at the content of papers like this one, we can see what immigrant readers cared about and what filled these pages. The advertisements are particularly revealing windows into immigrant life. Steamship companies advertise ticket prices to Hamburg and other European ports, essential information for immigrants who wanted to bring relatives to America. There were ads for boarding houses, often specifying kosher kitchen or Sabbath observing to attract religious customers. Medical remedies filled many column inches, as well as job opportunities. The news sections covered multiple worlds simultaneously. Local New York news affecting Jewish neighborhoods, like sanitation issues, crime, local politics, and regulations. European news, especially from the Jewish world, reports of pogrom, anti-Jewish legislation, economic conditions, and more. Coverage from other American Jewish communities, what was happening in Philadelphia, Chicago, and Boston, and serialized stories and advice columns that made the paper essential for daily reading. This mixture of the practical and the cultural, the local and the transnational, the Jewish and the general, made the newspaper essential to navigating immigrant life. By 1916, we can see the transformation and the degree of cultural assimilation. In Sarasohn's Yiddish daily Yiddish Tageblatt, the Jewish daily news, which we see here, there was also an English section showing integration into American media norms in form and content. The Yiddish part as well shows American press trends, large and bold headlines, and sensational framing. However, Sarasohn maintained the Jewish character of his newspapers by including sections on Jewish news around the world, considering the Jewish angle of local and international politics, and publishing on weekdays only, while other Yiddish newspapers, like the Forwards, which was founded in 1897, published 7 days a week, including the Sabbath. In the beginning, Sarasohn's approach was influenced by the European Yiddish press. Sometimes he even copied content, as we saw, later did the same for him. But gradually he moved to the American local model and adapted it for immigrant Jewish readers, many of whom weren't accustomed to reading newspapers in Yiddish or at all. Unlike the Maskil press in Hebrew in Europe and to some degree in the United States, Sarasohn aspired not just to educate but also to sell as many copies as possible. He was an entrepreneur and a businessman, and he understood the American market and the Jewish market. But who would read these newspapers? Initially, as we mentioned, it was challenging. Yiddish newspapers were aimed at immigrants and their families. But at first, there weren't large numbers of immigrants. Let's think of the numbers. Between 1871 and 1880, there were only 15 to 20,000 Jewish immigrants. Between 1881 and 1819, about 190,000. And between 1891 and 1898, about 350,000 Jews. But in the turn of the 20th century, the numbers increased with an average of 100,000 Jewish immigrants coming from Eastern Europe every year until World War I. The readership grew with the immigration waves. It also grew due to local commercial changes in the press, which we'll discuss soon. Until the mid-1880s, Sarasohn had relatively little competition in the field. During the 1870s and half of the 1880s, he was quite alone in the field. But from the mid-1880s onward, he faced competition from a new direction, the emerging socialist Yiddish press. Jewish Workers' Union and Socialist Circle began operating in 1885 to establish a socialist Yiddish newspaper. Their goal was to spread socialist ideas among workers. This press ranged from socialism to anarchism and anything in between, ideologies which Sarasohn opposed. His opposition had multiple reasons. First, these new publications were a commercial threat for his monopoly. Second, his religious orientation as an observant Jew with a traditional approach was different from the secular orientation of his competitors. And third, his political and ideological opposition to socialism situated him at the other side of the spectrum. In addition, these were very different and even opposite different business models. Sarasohn had a private-owned press based on commercial entrepreneurship and profit-making, while the socialist press was funded by the Socialist Labor Party, SLP, or other political actors and wasn't intended for profit. In addition to political changes, during the 1880s and 90s, major technological developments in the American market profoundly affected the press in general and the Yiddish press in particular. First, paper production. The shift from rag-based paper to wood pulp paper lowered paper prices, and the result was cheaper newspapers and wider distribution. Second, the emergence of the evening newspaper. It grew in popularity and it was read on the way home from work by thousands, hundreds of workers. Third, worker organizations, including in typesetting and typography, changed the profession. And fourth, and maybe the most significant change, the transition from manual typesetting to linotype machine, automated line composition, was much more efficient and faster and changed the ability to produce multiple newspaper copies. By the early 1900s, the American Yiddish press had Orthodox newspapers, socialist and labor press, anarchist publications, specialized newspapers for farmers, chess players, children, and whoever you can think of, women's papers, and more. This diversity reflected the complexity of immigrant Jewish life and the strength of the press as a cultural institution. This beautiful cover of Zukunft, the future, shows the sophistication of Yiddish cultural magazines by 1920. Notice the artistic design, the silhouette artwork. This is a far cry from the cramped, simple layouts we saw from the 1870s. The Yiddish press was also the pathway for Yiddish literature in Europe and in America. The Zukunft, which published Yiddish literature, poetry, and essays, was but one example for this phenomenon. In the next lecture, we'll explore one case of a Yiddish short story by Yitzhak Dov Berkowitz, which was published in the Zukunft. But before we move to literature, let's consider how people engage with these newspapers in their daily lives. Newspapers were often read aloud in tenement apartments with the entire family gathered around. They were discussed in coffee houses and street corners. Workers read them on the streetcars and elevated trains going to and from work. And this is precisely why the evening editions became so popular, time to catch the commuter traffic. The cost was important too. By the 1890s, daily newspaper cost just 1 or 2 cents, affordable even for poor workers earning a few dollars a week. This accessibility was crucial to the press's democratic function, allowing it to reach the masses rather than just the educated elite. As I said, Yiddish newspapers were the primary publication venue for Yiddish fiction, poetry, and serialized novels from the 1880s and well into the 20th century. This created a symbiotic relationship. Writers needed the steady income and wide audience those newspapers provided, while newspapers needed compelling content to attract readers and compete with rival publications. Serialization also shaped the writing itself in important ways. Authors had to create suspense at the end of each installment and each chapter at a dramatic moment to make readers come back tomorrow or next week and keep the narrative moving to maintain reader interest over weeks or months, or sometimes even years. This is the cover of Sholem Aleichem Gesammelte Werk, collected works. Sholem Aleichem published regularly in the Yiddish press, and we'll discuss this also soon. In this issue of the Yiddish daily Wahrheit, The Truth, published 110 years ago today or tomorrow, we see an example for the phenomenon we just discussed. On this page, we see a chapter of Sholem Aleichem's story, Motel Paisi, the Cantor's Son. By the way, this is one of the last chapters. Sholem Aleichem died on May 13, 1916. So, the most popular Yiddish writer of his time, and well after his time, published in an American Yiddish daily his serialized Yiddish novel, since it was the most efficient way to secure a steady readership. Of course, many other Yiddish writers did the same, making the Yiddish press the leading arena for literature. And since we see Motel, let's hear him in his own words how he described the Yiddish press in America and its significance for Jewish immigrants. In American newspapers, you can find anything your heart desires, from nectar to ambrosia. Are you looking for a job? You'll find it in the papers. Are you looking for help? You'll find it in the papers. Are you looking for a suitable husband or wife? You'll find them in the papers. Are you looking for a business? You'll find that too in the papers. This is a paragraph from Motel Paisi, the Cantor's Son, translated by Tamara Kahana, whom I mentioned in the beginning of my lecture. She was Yitzhak Dov Berkovich's daughter, Sholem Aleichem's granddaughter, and she was also the translator. So why is this quote so important? It shows beautifully the role of the newspapers in immigrant life. The newspaper was a leading institution for immigrants, and when Motel says newspapers, he means Yiddish newspapers. So Yiddish newspapers helped immigrants finding work, locating family members, building communities, accessing culture, promoting education and political engagement, and providing highbrow and lowbrow entertainment. Let me give you a concrete example of this practical function. In the classified section of Yiddish newspaper, one could have found information wanted notices. These were desperate pleas from immigrants trying to locate family members who had come to America and lost contact. So you could read an ad like, "Looking for my brother, last known to be in Philadelphia," or "Seeking information about my sister who left Minsk in 1905. These notices were often successful. People across the country read them, recognized the names, sometimes the faces when there was a photo, and helped reunite families torn apart by migration. The newspapers literally held communities together across vast geographical distances, connecting immigrants in New York with those in Chicago, Philadelphia, and other small cities, and also in Minsk, Odessa, and Warsaw. The Yiddish newspaper, whether it was a daily, a weekly, a monthly, or a quarterly, served both as a consumer product and as cultural institutions. Newspapers were simultaneously a commodity and a cultural institution, an educational tool, and a community center in print form. Why did I call this lecture the paper bridge? Because that was what newspapers were. A bridge between the generations, a bridge between the old world and the new world, a bridge between Yiddish culture and American local culture, a bridge within the scattered Jewish community across American cities, and a bridge between being a greenhorn, a new immigrant, and becoming an American and a man or a woman of the city in particular. True, the emergence of the Yiddish press wasn't just a Jewish phenomenon. It was part of a larger story of immigrant and ethnic press in America. Germans, Italians, Poles, Irish, and other immigrant groups created their own newspapers in their own languages. Nonetheless, the Yiddish press was one of the largest and most influential press systems, lasting longer than most and having a profound impact on American Jewish identity. But we must acknowledge that we're telling the story of something that ultimately declined. The peak years of the Yiddish press were roughly until the early 1820s. By the 1930s, circulation was dropping steadily. This was due to generational shift and Americanization. The children of immigrants, the second and third generation, learned English in American or public or private school. They could read English newspaper easily. They wanted to be Americans, not greenhorns, and language was a key marker for identity. Reading an English newspaper was a sign that you made it, that you were modern and American. The Yiddish newspapers increasingly seemed old-fashioned, associated with the immigrant generation and the old country. Some Yiddish papers tried to adapt to this new reality. They added English sections, as we saw with Sarasohn Tageblatt, but most Yiddish newspapers simply disappeared as the readership aged and died. As immigration streams weakened and practically ceased from the mid-1920s, the Yiddish press lost its future readers. Yet the legacy of the Yiddish press is profound and lasting. It shaped how American Jews understood themselves and their place in America. It created a vibrant public sphere for debate about Jewish identity, politics, Zionism, socialism, and culture. It preserved and developed Yiddish as a modern literary language capable of expressing contemporaries' ideas and life experiences. It connected communities across America and between America, Europe, Palestine, the Ottoman Empire, and more, and built a sense of collective Jewish identity among diverse immigrants. These newspapers are invaluable sources for immigrant life, Jewish culture, labor history, and the transformation of Jewish American society in the early 20th century. Thank you.